Hi everyone, Stephen here at Teach Me Music, and today we're going to be talking about amp settings and tone in general, and the difference between those is pretty straightforward. So amp settings are whatever you do with your amplifier, and I'll explain a few different variations that you can get, and tone is what comes from the bass. So if you turn any dials, that is affecting the tone if it's on your bass. And if you're turning dials on the amplifier, that is obviously your amp settings. So we're going to talk about the amp first, and we'll talk about the bass last. So this is a Laney Nexus SL, and this is what we call a bass head. The reason why it's called a bass head is because it can separate from the bit at the bottom, which is what we call a bass cabinet, or bass cab for short. You can get different configurations of amplifiers. So this one is a bass head that connects to a bass cab, and this is a Laney N210, which is the bass cab. So it's called a 210 because it's got two 10-inch speakers in it. So the best thing about this configuration is if I need to go somewhere to do a gig or to take it portable, I can separate the bass head, which is quite small and quite portable because it doesn't weigh a lot. I can put it in a bag. I can go to anywhere, like a gig, a recording studio, somewhere that I need to play bass, and I can connect it to any bass cabinet. Obviously, it's nice to have your own, and you'll have a personal preference, but if you need to, you can just go anywhere and connect it to any bass cab, but you've still got the amp settings with you because they're built into the bass head. So that is obviously what this thing is right here. And the best thing, again, the best thing about this is, although it's a more expensive setup, it means that you can have a lot more options, a lot more things to change, and it gives you a more customizable sound. And that's why this thing looks like a spaceship with loads of dials on it. So I'm going to talk you through the main dials today for most bass amps. I'm also going to be using what we call a bass combo, and a combo amp is where the bass head and the cabinet are in one solid unit. And that means that if I need to take that anywhere, unfortunately I've got to lift the whole thing up, speaker and bass head, everything together, and it's just a lot harder to take anywhere because it's not as portable. So the best thing about a combo amp, although it's not very portable, is it's actually cheaper because it all comes together in a solid unit, and it's all the same branding as well. So I'll show you a Laney RB3, which is the bass combo, and the speaker and the bass head are all kind of Laney influenced. So it's just so you're aware. The main things that we want to talk about today is gain, bass, middle and treble, and volume. There's a million things on this. We're not going to talk about them today. I'm going to talk about them in another video because they're a little bit more advanced, and most bass amps don't have them on anyway. So we're just going to cover the main ones just so you know whatever amp you've got at home, you know what the dials do, and you're good to make some noise. So what is gain? This is something that most bass players and most people get wrong. Gain is not volume. People think that when you turn gain up, that because it gets louder, they think it is volume. Well, gain is basically how hard you're driving the signal going into the bass head or into the bass cabinet or into the bass combo. So the idea is if you overdrive the signal, you get what is commonly known as distortion. So if you think about rock music and guitar players, distortion is actually a really cool thing. But most of the time for bass players, we don't want constant distortion. We want to be able to turn distortion on and off like a pedal, which I'm going to talk about in another video, so don't worry. So the idea is that if you have a bass that puts out a lot of volume, what we need to do is we probably need to have the gain lower. So if we have a bass that puts out a lot of volume, we need to turn the gain down. And if you've got a bass that doesn't put out as much volume, we need to turn the gain up to kind of counteract it. So the idea is the easiest way to set it is to play an open E note with everything plugged in. And what we do is we start from 0, which means we're going to get pretty much 0 sound because obviously the gain is 0. make sure your volume is up to a certain level, otherwise you'll get no sound whatsoever, because the volume is what connects the bass head to the speaker, or what connects all of the things you've just changed, the dials. Volume is the last thing that goes to the bass cabinet and the bass speaker. So if you've got 0 volume, the speaker is doing nothing. If you've got a little bit of volume, you'll be able to hear the difference when you're tweaking the bass head. So a little bit of volume, and then play an open E note, and just gradually turn the gain up as the string is making a sound. So basically what you want to do is you want to play the open E note, and you want to hear the sound as it starts to break up and starts to distort, and then you want to dial it down a little. So this bass and this amp is going to start breaking up roughly around about 5 or 6 in terms of gain, and all we want to do is bring that down. So I'm going to leave it roughly about 4, and you can tweak this literally from practice session to practice session, gig to gig, every time you pick the bass up. But it's just to give you an overall way of setting the gain so you don't get a really bad sound. So just to reiterate, and just to 100% make sure you know what I'm on about, gain is how hard you're driving the signal. And we can say that the signal is hot, which means really, really energetic, and that's when you're going to get distortion. Or it can be cold, where it's really, really low. What you want to do is you want to go for that warm signal, which means somewhere in the middle. And depending on what bass you play, that's going to be different. Another thing that you need to do as well is in this amp, another thing that you have to be aware of, and this amp actually has it, some amps don't, is this amp has high and low input. So you'll see high, and then there is one underneath that says low. This is to match the bass guitar that you're using. So if your bass is active and puts out a lot of volume, and it's an active bass with a battery, and if you don't know what I'm on about, then definitely go check out my anatomy of the bass guitar. This basically means that you're giving out a lot more signal, so you plug it into the high input, and that way you're going high output, so really high volume of the bass goes into the high input of the amp, because it squashes it, and it does certain things which we're not going to talk about in this lesson because it's a bit more advanced, but it squashes the signal so it's not as hot, gives you a little bit more of a nice signal, which then obviously goes into the gain. And if you've got a low output or a low volume from your bass guitar, because it's a passive bass, which means no battery, then you need to plug it into the low input. So just think, if my bass puts out a lot of volume, it's going into the high. If my bass puts out low volume, it's going into the low. And if you don't know if your bass puts out a lot of volume or not, just look to see if it's got a battery in it. If it's got a battery, it's a high output, and if it's got no battery, it's a low output. Passive and active. Active is high volume with the battery. Passive is low output with no battery. So that's going to help you with that. This amp also has what we call a shape, which is this one right here. And this is a predetermined shape in the signal. So the first one is completely flat, which is what I recommend you use if you have this on your amplifier. The second one has a little bit of a scoop, which means lower in the mid-range, and mid is the middle of your bass frequencies. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The third one has an even bigger scoop, which means you're cutting out a lot more frequency, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the last one actually has a little bit of a notch or a little bit of a bump or a boost in the signal, which means you're going to get a lot more frequency coming out. So just to kind of go a little bit more into detail with that, when you play bass guitar, you're playing bass frequencies, which are the low, you're playing mid frequencies, which are the middle, and you're playing treble, which is the top frequencies. And the bass guitar covers all 3 of those, and by messing with them, you can get different sounds from your amplifier. So the predetermined shapes do that automatically. So I used a few fancy words there. So scoop, cut, boost, and these words basically affect how it sounds. So a scoop is when you're reducing, or what we call cutting, the signal. If you're cutting the signal or the frequency, it means that you're dropping it lower, which means that you're basically bringing it down. If you're boosting or increasing the signal, it means that you're bringing it up. And if we boost a signal, you're going to get more of that frequency in your playing, and it's going to change the sound of the bass. And you've got to do all of this by ear. That's the best way to work it out. Or if we're cutting and reducing the signal, it means you're getting less of that frequency. So imagine your bass playing, you've got low end frequency, middle frequencies, and then treble. And basically we're going to show you how all of those affect the sound. So if we kind of jump straight on to the next one, we actually see it's labeled bass. So this is the bottom end of your signal. If you're listening to a song or listening to a bass guitar and it's got a lot of thud and a lot of like rumble to it, that is the bass frequencies because they're the low end. They're the low part of the signal. So if you boost it, which means to turn it to the right, what's going to happen is you're adding more of that frequency. And if we reduce or cut, it means you're turning it to the left, and it means you're taking those frequencies out because it depends on the style of music that you're playing. So here's a really simple tip to get used to messing around with your amplifier. Take your bass guitar, play an open E note, and just turn the bass completely to the right and completely to the left. So let's do that now. So this is with the bass in the middle, which is what we call 12 o'clock. It's like a clock face. So 12 o'clock is straight up. So this is just the amp and my bass. Now let's play the note, and while the note's playing, we're going to turn it to the left first. So that is to reduce or to cut the frequency. So that was me reducing or cutting the bass frequencies. And if you want to know exactly what frequency that's changing, there are specs on all of the amplifier models and all of the manufacturers who make whatever amp you've got, because they are set at different frequencies, but they all do the same kind of job. So you've got to get used to hearing this. So what I've just done is a really fast version of what you should do, where play the note and just turn it. And if you can't hear the difference, then you definitely need to do it again, because it does take time to develop your ear. So that was cutting or reducing. We're now going to do the same thing, but we're going to boost, which means turn it up, which means to the right. So this is at 12 o'clock at 0. And now we're going to turn it. So if you didn't hear any difference, then you definitely need to do it at home with your own amplifier, just to kind of take things a lot slower, because you should be hearing a difference. And if you can't hear a difference, here's another little tip. If you start at 12 o'clock, turn it all the way to the left or all the way to the right, and then play your open E string again, you should hear a difference. If you don't, then you should kind of definitely check to see if it is working, because you should hear at least some difference. The reason why we're playing the E string is because this is the bass frequency of the bass guitar, because it's a really low note. So we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to jump to the mid, which is the middle. And the best strings to play so you can hear the difference of the mid is either the A or the D string. So I'm going to play the D string just because it gives you a little bit more clarity. You can hear it a bit better. So this is the D string messing around with the mid frequency, which is the middle of the signal. So let's make sure it's at 12 o'clock, so it's in the middle before we actually play anything. So this is just the D string with no kind of frequency cut or boost. Now what we're going to do is play the same note again, but I'm going to reduce or cut, which means turn it to the left. And then we're going to do the same thing, but turn it to the right, which is increasing or boosting the frequency. So that was to reduce or to cut the signal in terms of the frequency of the mid. We're going to do the same thing now, but we're going to boost it. So hopefully you can hear some difference, and you might have kind of realized that I've actually missed one of the dials, which actually says sweep. And this is something that some amps have, so I'm going to cover it just in case. Some of the mids of a bass amp have what they call a sweepable frequency, or they have a parametric kind of frequency. And what this means is you can actually change the frequency that's being messed with and being changed. So sweepable, or sweep in this, means you can sweep through the mid frequencies and you can select which one sounds best, and that is then controlled by the mid dial or mid knob on the amp. If you've got a parametric, what that means is you can actually set different frequencies as well, and you can also have what they call a graphic EQ. So a graphic EQ is where it actually looks like a graph, where you can actually slide dials up and down, and they have a label underneath which tell you which frequencies you're changing. So when we say EQ, it means equalization, and if you've ever listened to anything on a hi-fi or a stereo, it will have the same terms: bass, mid, and treble. And that is exactly the same thing as the amp that's behind me. So remember, bass is the bottom, mid is the middle, and treble is the top. And that is what we call EQ. Once again, you need to get used to hearing these differences, so just take your time, use the open string, make sure it's all plugged in and you've got some volume and some gain, and you will definitely hear it if you give yourself a chance. You will prefer certain things in certain places, and it's personal preference. So if you like the bass turned up like all the way up, as long as it sounds cool, awesome, nothing wrong with that. If you like the bass all the way down, as long as you like that sound, that's cool as well. We're going to show you how to set up the amp for different styles of music as we go, but for now, just find your own sound, have a little bit of a laugh. It's not an exact science, so if you have different amp settings to me or somebody else, don't kind of pay attention. It's absolutely fine. We don't actually care. You just need to know what's going on, and this is a brief introduction into what's happening. So let's talk about the treble, and the easiest way to check the treble is obviously using the treble dial on your amplifier, but we want to use the G string. So the G string is the highest string on the bass in terms of sound. So this is what the G string sounds like with no EQ added. And now we're going to do the same thing, but I'm going to reduce or cut the treble, which means turn it to the left. And once again, the easiest way to kind of hear that is to hold the note or make the note ring and then obviously turn it, which is why we're using open strings, because then you can use your other hand to turn the dial. Otherwise, you've got no hands free. Doesn't work. So let's boost the treble so you can hear the difference, and then that way we've covered all three different types of frequency: bass, middle, and treble. So once again, that is just a really, really quick speed through of what you should do at home, and take your time with it to hear all the differences. There are other amplifiers out there that have a few other little variations, or your amp might be really basic and just have gain, bass, middle, and treble, and then volume, and that's absolutely fine. So just to recap, gain is how hard you're driving the signal. Bass, middle, and treble are your frequencies and your EQ, and volume is how much volume is going to the speaker or the bass cabinet if you've got them separated. So I'm going to show you what a Laney RB3 bass combo looks like now, just so you can see the difference. And we're also going to talk about something called compression. So you might have noticed that the amp behind me has changed. It probably looks a little bit smaller. Don't worry, I haven't grown, I'm still short. So the idea is that we've changed the amp so you can see what a bass combo looks like. This is the Laney RB3, which I mentioned earlier. And the reason why this is a bass combo is because the bass head part is connected to the bass speaker or the bass cabinet part, and it's all in one unit. So this thing just comes literally as it looks. You pick it up, it all comes together. You can't break it down. So it's a little bit cheaper, but it's not as portable. It still sounds epic though, and if you're gigging, these things are still really, really good. The reason why we've changed it is because I just want to mention two things on it, because a lot of bass amps do have them, so I'm just trying to cover all bases. No joke intended. So this is a para mid, and this right here, which is the frequency, that works the same as the sweep on the RB. Nope. That works the same as the sweep that was on the Nexus SL bass head that we were talking about earlier. So this allows me to select the mid frequency being controlled by the mid dial that's right next to it. You can also get the graphic EQ, which is the one that looks like the graph with the dials going up and down, which I explained earlier as well. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is this right here, which says comp, C-O-M-P. It's literally just a button, and it's got a green light, which means it's working, and that is short for compression. Compression is basically where if I played a really quiet note, it basically boosts the signal to try and keep it more consistent, and if I played a really, really loud note, it squashes it, so it tries to keep it consistent as well. And what it does is it compresses the whole entire signal, so it gives me a more consistent sound. Compression on bass is really important because sometimes when we're playing really fast and we're changing technique and we're going hell for leather, playing some crazy stuff, which we will eventually, what we want is we want the compression to kick in, because then it's really, really nice and obviously consistent. So if you turn the compression off, it gives you a lot more space to play with, but sometimes if you play a really quiet note, you weren't meant to do that, you've just accidentally done it, compression will just boost that up nicely, and if you play a really loud note, compression will just bring it down. So it compresses from both sides of the signal. So that is what compression is. Compression can be found in pedals. It can also be found on amplifiers with a dial, so you can turn on how much compression you want. But for this amp, it is literally just a push-pull button, so it's either on or it's off. So it's just to kind of introduce you to the concept of compression, because it's a really important factor in playing bass. This amp, because it is also a practice amp, does have a lot of other dials. So we've got an aux in, which means you can plug in external music and it will play through the speaker. Really, really handy for practicing if your amp's got it. It's got headphones, which means you can connect obviously headphones to it, so your parents or your partner or whoever's around you doesn't want to smack you across the face because you're practicing. Doesn't want to smack you across the face because you're practicing at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's good to practice late. So that helps there. And then we've also got effects send, FX, and FX return. This is when you're using effect pedals, which we are going to talk about eventually in a different video. And essentially those two things allow you to send and return the signal from your effects. But we're not going to jump into that because that's just a different video. That's pretty much everything that most bass amps have. If your bass amp has any other dials or any other switches, then just kind of double check what it might do. If it doesn't make sense, I am going to cover literally everything in other videos because some of this stuff is quite advanced. But that's a basic introduction into your amp settings. So that covers that side of things. I know that's a lot to take in. Just kind of bear with it. You will get used to it and you will hear it. The last thing we want to talk about in this video is the tone on the bass guitar, which is all of these dials and switches down here. So we're going to basically zoom in, give you a close-up of what all these things do, and that way you can decide what's best for you moving forward. So the final part of this video, we're going to talk about the tone coming from the bass guitar, because that's really important as well. So all of these dials and switches down here actually do something, so we need to know what. I'm going to take you through the most common, but obviously because all bass guitars are different, if you're not sure what yours does, check out the website of the manufacturer and the model. It will have some kind of spec and it will tell you what each one controls, and I'm going to break them down for you now. So on most bass guitars, the first one that you're going to see is the volume. Obviously really dead simple. If you turn it all the way up, which is clockwise, that's volume all the way up. If you turn it anti-clockwise, that's zero volume. So right now, zero volume, you can't hear anything. So the next one, which is usually just below it, or kind of in a diagonal line, depends on where the dials are on the bass. This is what they call blend or pickup selection. This is what they call blend or a pickup selector or pickup selection. So if it's in the middle, so that is in the middle now, that is both of my pickups working at the same rate, they're both on. If I turn it clockwise towards this way, it's just the neck pickup. And if I turn it all the way to the other way, which is obviously that way, then it's just the bridge pickup. And we call them these names because that is closer to the neck, that's the neck pickup, and that is closer to the bridge, so that is the bridge pickup. This can dramatically change the sound of your bass guitar, so you might want to experiment, see what sounds better, and you can kind of half turn it. So I've just turned that a little bit up, so the neck pickup is slightly more accented, slightly more emphasized than the bridge pickup. So they're both on, but this one is working a little bit harder, that one's working a little bit less. Obviously this has loads of other dials as well, but the three most common are here. So these three right there, this is bass, middle and treble. And the idea is it's exactly the same as it is on the amp. If we turn it clockwise, we're boosting the frequency. And if we turn it anti-clockwise, we're cutting the frequency. So the main question that you may want to ask is, why do we have it on the bass guitar and the amplifier? Well, it depends on how you want to look at it. You can either use the amp and set your sound and get the dials all perfect, which is what I do, and then it just means you can just play bass and you can kind of forget all about the dials here. You can just get on with it, which is what I like to do, because then my sound is really consistent. If you want to be able to tweak your sound literally at the drop of a hat and within seconds, doing it from the bass guitar is a lot better. So if you're playing from one song to the other and you want to change the sound, using the dials on the bass guitar is a lot better because it's a lot more intuitive. They're literally just below your hand. And what you do with the amp is you just set everything either at a standard rate or you set everything at 12 o'clock. And you can do both if you want, but the idea is it's personal preference. So you want to decide whether the amp is more important, the dials and the tone on the bass guitar are more important, or you want to do a bit of both. And the best thing about this is if you start gigging or if you start playing with other musicians, the amp can be set, and then if you're playing along and you're like, oh, I just need that little bit more bass, just need that little bit more treble, or it just needs to be a little bit louder, you can use the dials on the bass to help you with that, rather than going, hang on guys, literally everyone stop what they're doing, and then walking over to your amp and turning the dial. That's going to take time, whereas you could literally just drop your hand down, turn, good to go. So it's up to you. It's just making you aware that you can do one or the other or both. And that is the most common settings on a bass guitar. You've got your volume, your blend or pickup selection, which is the same thing, and then you've got bass, middle and treble, where you can tweak the sound of your bass. Once again, if you check the website for the manufacturer and the model, you might have other switches like I do, you might have other controls, but they're not as common for most bass guitars, so we're not going to cover them in this video, but we will cover them in later videos when we get a bit more advanced and we start looking at stuff in more detail. So just get used to hearing your own bass guitar, mess around with the amp, mess around with the dials and the tone on the bass guitar itself, find a nice sound, and then later on down the line, we'll show you how to tune in and how to get a really nice reggae sound, rock sound, metal sound, etc. So have fun, mess around with all the dials, and when you're ready, I'll see you again next time.